Welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Steven Adair, the founder of Volexity, joins me today. We're going to talk about a wild story and a wild attack that was uncovered by Volexity, which they've called the nearest neighbor attack. There's been a lot written about this since it was disclosed a couple of weeks ago in late November and following a presentation that Steven gave at CyberWarCon. We'll go over as many of the details as we can, but in short, what we're looking at here is a Russia-linked APT that was able to remotely compromise the Wi-Fi networks of its intended target without being anywhere close in physical proximity to it. They did so by compromising neighboring Wi-Fi networks, creating this daisy chain of breaches and compromises until they were able to reach their target. Like I said, this is a wild story. APT 28, which is the group involved, was after some intel on Ukraine prior to the start of the war in 2022. That's how far this story goes back. And they've used this technique that really hadn't been seen or talked about before this investigation. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more details from Steven. So let's bring him in and get this episode going. How you doing, Steven? Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Michael, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Glad to be here.
And first of all, maybe let's just start with Volexity. Tell everybody a little bit about what you guys do, because I think it's important context for the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So Volexity, we're a cybersecurity firm that kind of has two main areas of focus. We're a software and a services company. On the software side, Volexity kind of has expertise, and we develop products for acquiring and analyzing system memory. So volatile memory RAM from a computer. We do that cross-platform, Linux, Mac, Windows. We also support various other network devices and one-off IoT and other type machines that sometimes can be difficult to analyze. Our team kind of has a background in pioneering this field of memory forensics. They also kind of, a lot of them work on and run the Volatility Project open source framework, but we have commercial tools for doing those acquisition analysis, and it's kind of like a really specialty field that we have to keep up on, and that's like a product that we sell to commercial entities, governments, law enforcement, and so on. But obviously, on the services side, we eat our own dog food. We are one of the biggest customers of ourselves. We use that in our own analyses, our own work. So on the services side, we do a number of different things, which include incident response and forensics. We do network security monitoring, kind of watching people's networks, looking for threats, kind of manage MDR, manage detection and response services, working with customers to kind of detect threats across their EDR, their network, and other sources. And then we kind of have a really big threat intelligence capability where we track a lot of threat actors, and that's either independently, like just going out there and doing our own research, or from things that we see from our engagements or attacks that we detect, and kind of like where the nearest neighbor attack came from.
And so let's just get into this, because I guess we should say at the top that obviously you can't name who the victim is or provide any detail in that respect. But to me, this is really fascinating, and we'll provide a link to the blog you guys wrote. And I think it's important too, a good story that Andy Greenberg wrote in Wired that really provides some other perspective on this. But I know Andy wrote about it, and I think it's important too that there's kind of started in 2018 when these guys were involved in an attack in the Netherlands with some Russian intelligence officers were arrested with a car full of Wi-Fi gear, trying to spy on activists there who were working against the use of chemical weapons. Is that the start of this kind of adventure? I mean, we're talking about a Wi-Fi attack. Is this something that APT 28 is this kind of in their arsenal?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the attack on OPCW and some of the other research out there related to, I guess, what could be called close access operation, where someone is physically, close to their intended target, physically there outside. Those kind of, there's some previous incidents, and the one you mentioned, which did involve hacking of Wi-Fi, but being physically nearby, which obviously has inherent risk. So, I mean, I think we ended up in some ways working backwards to that. Obviously, our initial attack, we didn't have attribution initially, and we later kind of linked it to what we call gruesome large, our APT 28. But you could say, yeah, those are certainly precursors to this. I mean, that type of operation could still be occurring. I mean, I don't doubt that it might be, but I mean, yeah, we're kind of seeing
Sure.
clearly, or at least is some form of evolution of that, which removes a bit of the risk of being physically detained, arrested, or observed.
Yeah, I mean, being able to do this remotely really kind of upends that whole dynamic. I mean, it removes the, like you said, the need to be within any kind of physical distance of your target, which is uh, fascinating and disturbing at the same time, I suppose.
Yeah, it is. When you think about it, and that was actually, kind of jumping ahead and kind of like our investigation. And I don't know if you ultimately want to start somewhere else on this, but the idea that someone might have been outside or kind of like say on the street parking lot, that was something we'd seriously considered and actually had conversations during this incident and the investigation before we had figured it out or cracked it, and actually talked about, hey, should we, should we, or we, the customer, work with their staff to pull surveillance footage and look outside and see, hey, is there someone parked outside during these times? Is it repeatable? Because we have different dates, we have different activity. We have at one point had effectively where like a region or area we suspected, and this was happening at odd times, like a lot of times 2, 3, 4 in the morning, where there's probably
Hmm.
not a lot of vehicles outside, for example. So that we didn't get that far, and I don't even know if the camera specifically would have been able to see that in this instance, but that was something legitimately, and you kind of laugh about it, but also being serious in that was something that was considered, that this maybe someone in physical proximity. So like that exact type of attack was on our mind and under consideration.
I mean, to do this remotely, the way that they ended up doing it, I mean, are we? How are they finding neighboring targets? I mean, if they're not in physical proximity, I mean, it's just as simple as Google Maps or something like that.
Yeah, so that part, the exact workflow of how the threat actor ended up on the the neighboring or adjacent organizations, we don't know 100%. So I mean, it could have been as simple as they hacked a bunch of places, turned figured out systems with Wi-Fi, and then identified our customer target and said, oh yeah, that's someone we really want. Or the alternative is someone did some form of scouting, Google Maps, Googling addresses, our intelligence are physically there and knew who's nearby, or otherwise had this information and targeted those organizations that were nearby. So we don't know the exact workflow, but they clearly, APT-28, our Russian threat actor, gruesome large, they clearly worked out how they would get into our victim, our organization, our customer, and that involved needing working credentials, which they were able to do password spraying and ultimately brute force and obtain, that they couldn't use, at least externally, to get on their VPN or any other services, their email, their productivity suite, that type of stuff. Kind of thwarted that point, but they were able to turn around and use that to get on their corporate or enterprise Wi-Fi. And yeah, they were able to ultimately pivot through, victimize other companies, other organizations nearby. Kind of the interesting part is, even just at that point, that didn't get them what they needed. They had to move until they found, for example, in this case, a laptop that was in a docking station that had wired internet, and then used its Wi-Fi connection to figure out what was nearby, what was available, and then leverage those credentials. I mean, it is a multi-step process. And then we talked about the daisy chaining. Kind of interesting was, part of our investigation, we realized that some of these other organizations nearby, their Wi-Fi was being accessed by our intruder as well from yet another organization, we say Org C. So Org B was being accessed by Org C. We also worked out and figured out they had access to their VPN. So there's a couple different ways in. We don't know, chicken and egg, how they get in first, but clearly, adept at making their way, onto systems in physical proximity, working their way through it.
I mean, it's a pretty good lesson too, that just demonstrating the lengths that these types of groups will go to if they want to access a high value enough target to them.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen over the time, we've seen some of the supply chain attacks that the North Koreans have done, that the Russians have done, what we call cozy larch, AP-29. If you think about, some of the more prominent examples like solar winds, we've seen, obviously now more and more edge devices, a number of 0 days that Valexity's found, and we're seeing, kind of seen exploited at our customers, who are, also high value targets for like the Chinese, for example, where we've seen them use the 0 days and Palo Alto Global Protect firewalls or Avanti Connect Secure VPN. where we've seen a combination of supply chains going, targeting and victimizing their customers. We've seen 0 days being used in edge devices, and obviously we get spear phishing and all kinds of other elaborate ruses being done by nation states against some of our customers. And this instance is the first and since then the sole time that we've really seen this, the Wi-Fi type attack, and it kind of just added to our, I don't say nothing surprises anymore, but it kind of surprised. You're like, wow, you look back and I'd say to get on Volexity's list of most brazen or interesting or impressive attacks,
Yeah.
it has to be pretty interesting at this point. And this certainly made and is still on the list for sure.
Why do you think it made sense for them to go this way as opposed to, looking for an exploitable vulnerability or using an O-Day? Was this just simpler? Given the complexity, there's a lot of work behind it, but still.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Part of it is we kind of speculate, like, this does fly under the radar. Even investigating, right, it posed a lot of challenges for us, and we do a lot of incident response. So you can kind of see where, hey, if someone was their goal is to not get caught to begin with. They're doing a lot of living off the land. Should they get caught or detected, the number of organizations that even have the ability to go in and have what we looked out on here, ultimately the Wi-Fi controller that gives you MAC address and authentication information where it is physically, that's actually few and far between from our experience. So, like, I would think even when if they get caught at some stage of this, there's a lot of places where it would be a little bit more of a dead end or a lot harder to even get to where we ultimately, arrived at. Or, I think it's just when people start tracing or going backwards, they might go, Wi-Fi node, oh, could this be a user? I don't really manage this. I really have no idea who's on my network. I think part of it could play into that the difficulty of investigating while flying, by hopefully not being detected to begin with and flying under the radar on something that's not as monitored or as hard to investigate probably played a role. If you kind of the presentation we've done on it kind of said as much as like, hey, in my opinion, maybe it would have been easier to, you have this working credentials to then phish the user or call them and say you're IT and at scale, maybe, or scaling a handful of users, 2, 3, 4 over time, but trick them into giving you a multi-factor to get on the VPN. But those would also be potentially, if you're going to really do living off the land, would be temporary mechanisms. Whereas this Wi-Fi method, in a way, is kind of like a permanent mechanism. I can keep going back to that. If I have this access to this other network and these credentials work, I can go in time and time again, and I'm not tricking a user into giving me their multi-factor, so I can get on their VPN, which might be monitored a little bit closer, logged a little bit better. And then once I disconnect, I can reconnect at will. And remember, specifically, we did not see them deploy malware at any point in time. So yes, if I got on, I could trick a user one time, get on with MFA, and then I need some other way to get back. I either believe I can trick that user again over and over again to get on what I want, or I need to leave some other mechanism to get back in that network. And they basically weren't doing either of those. So this mechanism worked really well in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioning living off the land there a couple of times. Is that's a huge edge too? Because I imagine all of this looks like legitimate traffic, legitimate activity. I imagine there weren't many alerts kicking off here, and there's no vulnerability, there's no exploit, like you said. Is that a fair assessment?
It's pretty fair. Some of what they did end up being a little bit sloppy in terms of like especially when they ran, the tooling or this privileged escalation 0 day in the Windows print spooler service, which is what almost basically 2 years later let us go, oh man, the public reporting on this being exclusively gruesome large APT28, which really forest blizzards, what Microsoft calls them. That's ultimately what has kind of really give that attribution. And that tooling specifically wrote things, and just how we initially found them, into the root of the program data folder. And I'd imagine over time there's some other things that would alert, and some of when we caught them later on were some alerting that took place. So they weren't perfect, but they did try to take a lot of actions that were normal user behavior, or normal administrative activity, that type of actions on the system, which do fly under the radar, generate either no alerts or fewer alerts, or with a lot of alerting these days, it could be like brushed under the rug or ignored. So I think they probably have been and potentially are still doing this other places where maybe they're not being detected, or they're being detected, it's amongst a lot of alerts and it kind of gets missed. So I think that's part of it. And it's also a technique, living off the land is not new. it's a lot of what we've been seeing a lot of other threat actors move to, especially with EDR and other detections, is really trying to blend in as much as possible. But ultimately, the threat actors need to get stuff or do things, if they want to maintain access, or then that probably will trip alarms at some point. And it's kind of just up to us as defenders or organizations that are wanting to protect our users and data to kind of be able to listen for those signals and investigate them.
Is living off the land, are you seeing more of it in terms of APT activity now, or is it just getting more attention because of the typhoons, et cetera, just those kinds of high profile attacks?
Yeah, it's definitely both, without a doubt. So if we take kind of some of the most recent 0 days we've worked on, like I mentioned, the Palo Alto one and the Avanti Connect Security, we also worked on a Fortinet 0 day in between those in February of this year, where the threat actor exploiting the 0 day, what did they do next? In all three of those cases, primarily the things they did were living off the land, at least once they got off the edge device. Now, in the Avanti case, we did see some web shells being placed internally, but they never dropped any remote access Trojan. A lot of what they did was living off the land. In the case of Palo Alto, we had the two initial victims when we found that 0 day. They did have some tooling they ran on the firewall, but when they moved into the organization, they basically grabbed files off of machines, off of user systems like cookies and different DP API keys, the tooling that they took. They did that like kind of like that's a living off the land. They weren't deploying malware, they weren't putting remote access to it, they weren't putting web shells, and that's kind of I kind of attribute that to getting detected and caught in a lot of cases. And you see where we mentioned
Right.
they did put that malware. It's on that edge device that doesn't run AV or EDR. So it's a little bit safer. Not completely safe, but a little bit safer to do it there. And that is, I would say it's been going on for a while, but it's definitely a trend that is happening more and more. And I think it is the endpoint or the host based detection that's playing a really big role in that being necessary.
So you guys got called into this almost 3 years ago now, and so I'm just curious, when you look back on this kind of from a big picture perspective, what stands out the most to you, either from an ingenuity perspective or technical efficiency? What do you like about this? What fascinates you about this still?
Yeah, it's kind of the ingenuity, right? This the fact that they managed to pull this off, right? And we know like the idea of going and getting on a Wi-Fi. Like this doesn't have to be someone across the world, but they worked out how to do this from all the way around the world. Someone could be in Canada and do this. Someone could be this in California and do this in Washington. Someone could be in a Starbucks downstairs. Like kind of like the idea, like putting it into practice, or the idea that pen testers have hacked Wi-Fi. Like the idea of getting into a Wi-Fi isn't necessarily new. The ingenuity is in that someone worked out how to get working credentials they couldn't use it from across the world, get into multiple different other organizations, daisy chain that to actually jumping on their Wi-Fi. Also, in doing so, they evaded something, whether that's a product of their tooling, inadvertent or not. They didn't use DHCP. They assigned themselves their own static IP. Like we saw some kind of interesting things that kind of made a few steps in the investigation kind of hit dead ends or make us scratch our head a little bit. So it's really just kind of tying it all together, having the motivation to do it, and actually pulling it off. I'd say that big time. Obviously the impressive, they actually did use a 0 day, because we didn't really have a good answer. Like, hey, they logged in with this user and suddenly they were privileged execution administrator on that very, very first computer we looked at, and they had securely wiped their tooling and the files they had moved over, which was pretty neat, because I think if you read our blog, they use a tool called cipher.exe, and that's a built-in Windows utility. It's been in Windows since like 2000, but we've never, I don't believe we've ever seen that used in Engage. We talked to a lot of other people. I'm sure there's tons of people who listen and say, oh yeah, I use that utility all the time for something. I've heard of that. But if you go and Google it and DFIR, in our experience, it's very rare to see that. It's not, the attacker didn't have to bring delete or their own mechanism of overwriting files. They used a native utility we hadn't seen. So, they came prepared in a number of aspects to make it hard to recover their tooling. And that was pretty neat in itself. But obviously at the time we didn't know what that tooling was because they securely erased it. But thanks to that Microsoft blog that came out earlier this year, which was a 1-to-1 match with what we had investigated and noted and logged. We knew exactly who it was and what they were doing because of that. They did a good job of keeping that 0 day hidden from us, because if we had been able to go grab that, that would have been reported a lot sooner. So kind of interesting.
Right. Yeah, I mean, your blog's got obviously a lot of technical detail, but it's interesting, kind of the narrative in there about some of the ways they were able to frustrate you guys, or any investigator, just some of the techniques there, and like you said, cleaning, getting rid of some of important files that would have helped you in terms of memory and understanding what they were doing. Is that something I would imagine it's in the toolkit for a lot of APTs too, that just kind of covering their tracks aspect of it.
Yeah, there's varying levels that we see, whether they like securely wipe or have an effective way to do that versus they just delete it. That it's not, I would say, uncommon. I mean, a lot of attackers just regular deletes or they just leave it there. So it's not unheard of that we'll get like everything they had, especially if they weren't expecting to get caught. That sometimes attackers will leave stuff around, but a lot of the threat groups have gotten better at cleaning up after themselves. So yeah, that part isn't necessarily unheard of. And some of the other the fun stuff, and kind of like where a little bit different from the blog, where you get from like maybe a little bit in from Andy's story they did in Wired, our presentations. They've done this at CyberWarCon, and my colleague Sean and I did this at FTSCon, or kind of the volatility conference. We kind of go through a bit of like the process and tell the story, like how we investigated it, and where we run into hey, speculation, or we talk about, is it someone outside, or we literally walked around. I went to the customer's office and walked around and just looked at everything. Is there something plugged in that shouldn't be here? What could it be? And some of the things end up being visibility gaps on this device and how it connects to that part of the network. And where you have a lot of network visibility, we're port mirroring, but that's bypassing the port mirrors. And some of the stuff, it wasn't necessarily the threat actor like causing the headache. It was just it would be it's not nothing wrong with the setup per se. It's just they got lucky in the way things were connected, and that gave us blind spots. It's a mix of like, this is the reality of what IT looks like and what security looks like. But I will tell you, like, for Volexity, if you're a victim and we're doing an incident response, we will go unorthodox. We'll come up with solutions, and we will do our best to try to solve it, because we will lay awake at night and wonder, what could we be missing and how can we solve that? So our team did a really great job on continuing to follow up on this, despite like challenges. Obviously, our customer is awesome in helping us and figure this stuff out in some unorthodox methods.
Were the other organizations that were compromised, were they equally as helpful? I know in your blog you talk a little bit about that one of them wasn't too keen on sharing logs, etc.
Yeah, so we got it was a bit of a challenge. So yeah, the org B, we got a lot of work with. Org C, which is, we'll just say, also, there's no one here that I fault, and they all did a great job. We just kind of, for not going into details, it's limiting, not that anyone didn't want to cooperate or didn't cooperate. Everyone was great in this process, from people who are customers to not. Just some things kind of ran their course and couldn't be taken any further. And obviously this is being done remotely on spare time at some point for some of this. So it's like it's kind of hard not to go into the full details, but I think everyone did as much as reasonably possible, and some went well above and beyond. So including our team on this, and we just really wanted to get answers. And I overall, we got answers. Could we know every aspect of where everything started and every other entry point? That could be in the building across the street or buildings further down. We can't know everything, but we took it really far, more than I would say, more than usual. I think we're satisfied with that. So, but yeah, I would say they all did pretty good, and were very helpful when they did not have to be. So,
is it fair to say that the turning point in this was because you guys, they went quiet for a little while and then came back, and you were trying to get at logs and from devices and figure out what was going on, but you guys ended up finding a wireless controller, hidden away somewhere. Talk about that aspect of the investigation, and is it fair to call that kind of the turning point?
It's a bit of it. So I guess it technically wasn't hidden away. We just working with our customer, we were made aware of it later on, right? So like, hey, their Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Once we learned, hey, this actually is Wi-Fi, and they're like, oh, by the way, we have this controller, and we get credentials on it. And it took a little bit of time to get that all set up. And then once we got into this, we're like, wow, this is like, it was a brand, I don't want to say the type of controller brand, but it was one we hadn't been familiar with before. I hadn't seen before, weren't familiar with. We logged in, and Like if I said the brand, actually like an advertisement for them almost, because we were impressed with the level of detail. I mean, it literally had the controller, which like manages their the victim organization's access points, like the SSIDs, the password, the security, the signal strength, everything that you want to manage about it has that ability in it. It also reports on it, so you can see all the users that are authenticated, their MAC address, how long they've been connected, which access points they were connected to, what what the bandwidth spikes look like, the data transfer, and it went back 90 days or 180 days. I can't remember how much data it had, but when we got in there, and then we had the IP kind of confirmed that it was a wireless user at that point. I mean, yeah, it just gave us like a real. It didn't solve everything at that point, but it was a huge step forward and kind of let us then go, okay, well, here's the credential. How'd they get that credential? Okay, well, how long has this been going on for? Because we have radius logs now, and we can start to
Right.
unravel everything. And that was a huge turning point. At that point, we still didn't know where they were coming from, though, which was like kind of like the next biggest break, and ultimately
Hmm.
working with the customer to say, hey, anything that comes off these wireless access points, let's make sure we have that in our network traffic and the port meter going to Volexity sensor. When we got that, and the bad guy came back, the attacker came back, and they got on the Wi-Fi, and we said this like NetBIOS name service query, the NBNS query that went out. The information in that query was enough to identify where they were coming from. Yeah, and I'd say in some regards we got lucky on that, right? What if their network had some generic name and it just said computer or something? Like we would maybe be a bit of a dead end. I don't know. We might at some point go in and say, hey, can we get a handheld device to go track wireless signal strength and walk around the Washington D.C. and try and get a building security to let us. It would be a lot harder at that point if we didn't have such an identifiable name in the traffic. But yeah, those two things were both kind of like watershed events and really kind of cracking the next components of the case for sure.
And how did you guys get to the point where you're confident enough to attribute this to APT28? I mean, attribution's always a tough road.
Yeah, so and Volexity is always careful and tries to be about what we track a threat actor as and the naming and things like that and
Hmm.
confidence around it. The kind of the actual attribution. So I mean, we started off early on when we saw what they were going after. This customer could be of interest to multiple different countries and has been. We work a lot of Volexity works a lot of cyber espionage from different nation states. We most frequently we work China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But we work all kinds of others, the BEC scams, general malware, all kinds, all types of things. But those three countries in particular, and I think on this customer, all four of those would be interested in this. But to put this level of effort, the skill, and then obviously, without going into exact details, we said they were going after individuals working on matters and projects related to Ukraine. It kind of became apparent this is almost certainly going to be Russia. I mean, you could say, oh, sure, it could be
Right.
China trying to collect information on Ukraine ahead of the invasion that hasn't started yet from Russia. I mean, it's like it's the most likely case of it being Russia. So we kind of surmised Russia. We actually thought what we said, Cozy Larch or APT29 initially. That if we had to guess, that's what we kind of said we thought it's likely to be. It was when Microsoft put out that blog on Forest Blizzard. It kind of revealed that they were using this toolkit to use a Windows print spooler privilege escalation 0-day and a lot of the victim organizations. That blog that they put out, it detailed like literally the commands the tooling ran, the file names that it used, what it outputted to, and that was like an exact match on like 12 fronts for what we had seen. Like it's exactly what it was. Speaking with them as well as I believe their blog said it, they said, "Hey, this tool is believed to be exclusively by what they call Forest Blizzard, our gruesome larch, or APT28." So with that, I mean, obviously, yeah, if some other group had it, okay, it could be them. But if this truly is APT28 exclusively, that's kind of where we get the final attribution of we believe Russia pretty firmly, confidently, and now APT, all signs point to APT28 after
Right.
that. That's where the collaborative nature of people putting out information or having friends and partners at the other security companies is really
Yeah.
useful because we found that tremendously useful, and we've talked to them since then, and they're like, well, that's great, like like a kind of like, we all work together, but I don't know everything they're working on, I don't know everything I'm working on, but yeah, it's really useful when some of that research comes out like that. It's great.
Before we wrap up, I definitely want to talk about kind of like defending against these types of attacks. I mean, What's your advice? And because it's just so esoteric the way that they pull this off that, you know, what do you recommend organizations that, could be in line for this type of attack? What should they be doing or thinking about?
Yeah, so there's two things I'll mention on that. One is the I'll start in other reverse order of what I say here though. But one is like your traditional defenses of like cyber defense, and then the second one is things around Wi-Fi. And starting with Wi-Fi, we kind of mentioned, hey, in this perspective at this point, and it may not be practical, and you may not end up on the radar of an attacker, whether it's across the world or someone in the parking lot. But it probably is time to think of Wi-Fi, essentially is another external facing, endpoint, an edge device, so to speak, in terms of where like, well, if I have remote access to my network, I'm getting access to this sensitive service or other thing. I'm protecting it with a device policy. I'm protecting it with certificates. I'm protecting it with multi-factor authentication. Why? And there's plenty of places that maybe are already doing this, but I think most or a lot are not. Wi-Fi needs to be in that conversation and maybe at the forefront of when you deploy it, or now retroactively, figuring out how to bolt that on, right? So, hey, if I think, if I have a remote desktop service, I have a Citrix server, I have a VPN service, I have an email, and I protect all of that stuff because I'm worried about someone getting my data, my networks, my colleagues, my systems. Like Wi-Fi is now, it's been proven it's probably less likely in some ways because you have to be in, you have to have a device, you have to be or have a device in proximity, but it should be in that conversation about being protected in the same way because it is a entry point into your network. And obviously there's places that are using like a shared password that they haven't changed in 10 years. And people know why that's a bad idea in general. But this kind of underscores what an advanced threat actor or a motivated actor can and potentially will do. And that's where kind of preventing just a simple username and password or just a simple password for getting Wi-Fi networks might be a really key thing to think about in your risk profile. There's a couple other things like, hey, maybe I don't name my wireless access point after my company because if someone's looking for me, they'll automatically know that's us. I mean, that's an obscurity thing. That doesn't make you more secure technically, but it could be like, hey, if someone's actually looking to break in and your org name versus it just says cool Wi-Fi 123, it's a little bit harder to figure that out. We kind of say also
Yep.
like you could potentially dial down the signal strength. So like if you're across the street, yeah, and people have directional antennas and stuff potentially, but like in general, if I'm sitting in my car, I'm at a Starbucks. If your signal strength is tuned down, so your people in your office can use it just fine, but it's not showing up on the wireless list, or wireless access point list at the Starbucks, probably a good thing. It doesn't hurt to do stuff like that. So you kind of see that as like some of the measures specifically around Wi-Fi. Then obviously your computer network defense, right? Having security, paying attention to signals. Volexity really believes in. We really believe in endpoint security across the board, EDR and all that stuff. But we also kind of have a lot of focus and find a lot of value where people don't deploy as much, or at least not the way we do, with having network security visibility, the ability to look, full packet capture, IDS, be able to go in and look at the flows of what systems talk to what, be able to work something back and not just use a log file or like an EDR record to kind of figure some of that data out. So kind of just really having those defenses internally, but then an attack like this, you need to, when a signal comes through, you need to investigate it and really work hard to work that backwards, like all incidents, but you have to be particularly motivated and maybe even think outside the box. So kind of say like the
Right.
traditional security stuff at an org, yeah, you need all of that. Potentially network stuff can be a big help. And then, the items around seeing wireless essentially is another external, way into your network and looking at protecting that similarly that you can in other sensitive sources.
Yeah. Do you imagine this attack changing threat modeling at all around this? Or, I mean, if you're a target already of these groups, I suppose. But
I mean, I think it could give the threat model of like at least what someone considers. I think it should change that a bit if you weren't considering it before. I mean, protecting your Wi-Fi isn't like a new idea or anything, but like, hey, this
right.
actually happened. Now, in terms of like, well, when things get published, will someone else start doing this now? They're like, oh yeah, I'll access all these systems. I could find some programmatic way to turn on the Wi-Fi and expand it. I mean, that very well could happen, right? A criminal actor could find some way to script this up and start analyzing that and thinking like, well, I could credential stuff a Wi-Fi from a device that's dual home that automatically. I think it's plausible that there could be an uptick in people thinking about this as a result. So I think it should be given a lot of thought for organizations. I don't know how much it will actually change, but it's kind of just really putting it out there that this, has and is happening. So it should be
Right.
considered if it wasn't previously.
All right. So, Stephen, thank you so much for coming on. Just kind of as a last question, just a general big picture question around recent APT activity. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of strategic changes or different kind of aggression that's worrisome, especially to critical infrastructure?
Yeah, the biggest change I kind of see is it's definitely around edge device security is a huge one, right? We're having more and more firewalls, VPN appliances, other services that are designed to be, internet facing. Yeah. Threat actors are spending significant efforts and time figuring out how to compromise those devices and operate on an area that's like harder to monitor, and is less, like, people have less ability to collect or even do forensics on it often. I mean, that's a big part. That's for critical infrastructure. This is stuff that you're seeing with the telecoms. This is stuff we're seeing on our customer base. I mean, this stuff, even once it's being used as a 0-day, it's ultimately weaponized, it's commoditized, or it's you see like the cases where the vulnerability is being patched and the threat actor who's using it sparingly hits everything they can, so it ends up impacting everyone, even if it was more narrowly focused to begin with. So, I mean, I think that's a really big item that is impacting a lot of places. It's been going on for a bit now, and I think it's just going to continue.
All right, Stephen, I think that's a good place to leave it. I really want to thank you for coming on and giving me the time today. This is a wild story, and just hearing more about it just fascinates me. I love this kind of stuff, and I'm sure it wasn't great for the victims, but from a research point of view, I think it's super important to hear these kinds of stories. So I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. I'm glad we could share a bit of our story what the Volexity team does, and I hope you have a great weekend.
All right, man. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.